Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for the invitation to participate today. I'm sorry not to be able to join in person, but I am very pleased to contribute to this important discussion on behalf of the OECD and on behalf of the OECD Tourism Committee, which since the start of the crisis has been working to support the response and recovery efforts. Of course, we know that we all know how our lives have been turned upside down by this pandemic, and the tourism sector is a sector that has been particularly hard hit, with international tourism falling by around 75 to 80% last year, and more in some places. And this is a completely unprecedented drop. You know, the outlook remains very, very uncertain for the coming months and beyond. The crisis has hit the tourism economy hard, and the encouraging vaccine news at the end of 2020 did boost hopes for the recovery in 2021, but we know that many challenges remain, not least with the vaccine rollout and with the emergence of new variants. So we're not, unfortunately, out of the woods yet. There is a very long road ahead for tourism recovery. In the short term, there is a need to continue to support tourism workers, to support tourism businesses, to help them, to support them through this crisis, but also to support them to adapt to what tourism will be like in the future. There's also a need to look at how to tackle the medium and long-term consequences of the crisis, and what we need to do to tackle those consequences. What will tourism look like 1, 2, 5, 10 years from now? What are the implications for tourism demand, for the tourism offer, for tourism supply? How can we address these challenges, and how can we also take advantage of opportunities that may arise from the crisis? So these are issues which are on the agenda of the OECD Tourism Committee and its Working Party on Tourism Statistics, and the committee discussed these issues when it met last week. It's also being discussed here today within the APEC Forum and in many other forums, in G20 and so forth. We know that supporting the recovery, strengthening resilience in our economies is now a priority to boost the growth prospects and recovery prospects, to build forward better, and also to prepare for future shocks. And 1 year on, as we look at where we are, 12 months on from the start of the pandemic, the economic environment remains very challenging. OECD now expects that global GDP will return to 2019 levels by the middle of this year. That's after a fall of about 3.4% in 2020. But this recovery remains weak, it remains uneven, and it remains very fragile. And the shock to tourism, to the tourism economy, is having an impact on the recovery, because the tourism sector has been slower than other sectors to bounce back. The analysis that OECD has done shows that the economies most dependent on travel and tourism have generally experienced the biggest drops in GDP. And in fact, the analysis shows that the pre-crisis size of tourism in the overall economy better explains the drop in GDP than the drop from other sectors, or from the stringency of lockdown measures. We see clearly the importance of tourism in the economy. And these impacts, this is linked with the sheer scale and scope of this crisis, and the fact that the crisis is it's affecting all parts of the tourism system. It's affecting businesses of all sizes that are offering interdependent services within this system. We know that some destinations are more exposed than others, and just as the impacts vary from place to place, so too will the recovery. So a coordinated approach is all the more important in this context, to get tourism back up and running, working together with the private sector, with businesses of all sizes throughout the ecosystem, but also working across a range of different policy areas and across different levels of government. And of course, now we have the additional need to engage even more closely with health authorities. The crisis is also putting at risk the survival of many tourism businesses, and this we are all aware. We've got many the future of many small and micro businesses, and we know there are many in tourism, but the future of many of these businesses is now hanging in the balance. SMEs in general are more vulnerable to these kinds of shocks. They lack the capacity and the resources that bigger businesses have to cope. And the crisis in particular has highlighted the financial fragility of many tourism SMEs. It's safe to say that the full scale of the crisis in terms of the impact on SMEs is not yet apparent. The government supports that have been put in place have limited business failure in the sector since the start of the pandemic. We have not seen in general across the OECD an increase in bankruptcies. And in fact, some economies report lower levels of bankruptcies than might normally be expected. And this is linked very much with the government supports that are there. But that being said, we know that many tourism businesses are facing very much existential decisions about the future, and small tourism businesses in particular need specific supports. So in many ways, this crisis has been a call to action from governments at all levels, from the private sector, to take the coordinated responses that are needed to prepare and support the recovery. Though we know the evidence and we know the results so far here have been quite mixed and maybe not as good as we would have hoped or we would have expected. But tourism is benefiting hugely from those economic packages that I mentioned. You know, governments really have taken impressive measures during the crisis to support the economies, and the tourism sector is benefiting hugely from these supports. You know, this includes the measures to cushion the blow for workers, to support tourism businesses to survive and adapt, but also to lay the ground so that the tourism sector is well placed to recover in the months and in the years ahead. And it also includes measures to support the safe restart of international travel, which we know is going to be critical to the tourism recovery. This is an area that the OECD is working on to develop a framework based on testing protocols and information sharing to enable countries to reopen their borders and safely restart international travel when the epidemiological situation allows. And OECD is working very closely with the World Health Organization, with ICAO and with other organizations who are active on these issues. I suppose a key question is, what will tourism look like in the future? And much depends on how governments, how industry, how travellers respond today. The tourism as a sector now needs to be rebuilt, and there's a lot of talk about building back better. There's now talk about building forward better. So we have a new hashtag of building forward better. But we really do have an opportunity in many ways to look at the tourism sector, to see how we can move to stronger, fairer, more sustainable models of tourism. But to do this, and this has been an ambition within many efforts within the sector for many years, to do this, we really need to already consider the longer term impacts of the crisis and to reflect the economic, the environmental, the social aims in the design of the response and the recovery measures that are put in place today. And digitalization, which I know is a key topic for this workshop, digitalization is a key part of this. You know, COVID-19 has accelerated many digital trends that were already in train before the crisis, but these have been accelerated with increased demand for digital tools, for digital solutions that can support safe and seamless travel and tourism experiences, you know, including, for example, contactless services at airports or e-check-in at hotels and so forth. So there are many ways the crisis has given momentum for the digital transformation of tourism SMEs, of SMEs in tourism, but also SMEs in the wider economy. And our colleagues working on SMEs more generally here at the OECD tell us that business surveys indicate that up to 70% of SMEs have adopted new digital practices in the last 12 months to cope with the pandemic and to adapt and survive the pandemic. The OECD Tourism Committee work on the uptake and use of digital technologies has identified a range of measures that are particularly needed to address the digital gap for tourism SMEs. And these include taking steps to ensure that tourism SMEs have access to the digital infrastructure they need, to the tools, to the different solutions, and particularly as many tourism SMEs are in remote and regional areas. Also, there's a particular need to strengthen the capacity of small tourism businesses to adopt and to use new technologies. And just last week, the OECD Tourism Committee approved a new report on the skills that workers in the sector, that managers in the sector need to really develop a digital tourism economy and for businesses of all sizes to thrive within that digital tourism economy. So that report will be published in the coming weeks, and we'd be very pleased to share it in the meantime with everybody. When we look at the measures that countries have put in place to support the sector during this crisis, we see evidence that governments are taking steps also to embed digitalization into these recovery efforts. And here, for example, on slide, you'll see a number of examples, and we've aimed to include mainly examples from outside the APEC region, so as to bring some perspectives from beyond the participants in this workshop. In Greece, for example, Greece has been working with Google to put in place a Greece from Home platform, which provides training in digital tools, which aims to provide training to enhance digital skills for workers and for businesses. Germany and Chile are two economies that have programs providing financial support to tourism SMEs, to support them to invest in the digital technologies and also to upskill workers. And perhaps a third to mention is from Lithuania, which has very recently launched a new e-business tool to support the development of new tourism services and new products based on e-business solutions. So it's really looking at supporting new digitally facilitated business models. To circle back to my opening comments, and with this I will close, we need to move beyond talking about the impact of the pandemic, shocking as that is, and the critical need and the emergency within the sector at the moment. But we also need to start to better understand the medium, the long-term consequences of the crisis and what we need to do to tackle them, and to start already to do that. Among the questions we need to be asking are: what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, what are the structural changes from the crisis, and what reforms will be needed to address the economic, the environmental, the social challenges, and really start to engage in long-term resilience efforts for the sector and for the tourism economy. Another important question is how to improve the capacity of the sector to recover, to adapt, to prepare for future shocks. While we don't know where the next crisis is going to come from, we can be sure that there will be future crises, health crises, as well as other types of crises. So it is important that we start to learn the lessons from this crisis if we are to be better prepared for the future. And with that, I will close, and I thank you again for the opportunity to contribute to the workshop, and I wish you an excellent discussion over the coming days. Thank you.